Thomas Kelly is an amazing person to me. 20th century, mid-20th century figure, a philosopher.
Philosopher,
Yeah.
indeed.
A
published philosopher.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Best kind. Technical journals.
Yeah, he really got into those things. But that's not what we really remember him for. He said he wanted to make his life a miracle. And he set out in that regard, but then had several huge failures. One of them surrounded World War II and just the tragedy of what happened during that era. The other was he wanted to get a second PhD. Can you imagine? He had one, but he wanted a second. But then he had these woozy spells when he was doing his oral exams, and they failed him at, I believe it was Harvard. And he thought his life was over. In fact, the president of the college where he was walked with him all night long around the football field because he was afraid he might, commit suicide. And then it was after those two kind of crushing events that he began to speak in a whole other way. That intimacy with God, that awareness of the still small voice of God. And that's what was compiled after his death. He died young, and they took some of his lectures, really, and put them together, and we see that in Testament of Devotion. And I have read some of the material that he wrote, before that time, and then the material that he wrote after those crises. They're like night and day. And this Testament of Devotion is the best known.
Yes.
Another called Eternal Promise. But I just wanted to read a little passage for us, because here is one sentence that I just live off of sometimes because it describes me so easily. He says, I find God never guides us into an intolerable scramble of panting feverishness.
Yes.
And for us, if we're going to be attentive to the still small voice, we have to find ways to learn to let go of that intolerable scramble of panting feverishness.
That's why it's so important to understand the connection between hearing the voice of God and practices such as solitude and silence. And also service is very good to calm the feverishness.
Well, for today, I think one of the deepest problems we deal with Christians is distractedness. Just that sense of constant agitation. And I know, John, you work with that all of the time in the congregation you work with, and how to help people, how to help ourselves to let go of that kind of constant scramble of panting feverishness.
Well, we need to tell them and exhibit the calming effects of hearing God speak and encourage them to believe that that's for them also. Because normally that's a part of their feverishness, is they don't think that anything can come to them from God and stabilize their world so that they don't have to carry on.
Well, and it's a complex dynamic. We're so afraid of boredom. I think it was Eugene Peterson who wrote that the ancient Greeks did not actually have a word for boredom. And we look at life in the ancient world and think how boring, but it wasn't boring to them. It's just we have become so dependent on external stimulation that our capacity to manage our attention has become enormously weak. And that's
addicted to adrenaline, all that stuff.
Yeah, and there has to be, an iPod, television, a computer, something going on, or else if I don't have something to carry to occupy my mind, then I will be bored. And so I think part of listening to the still small voice that's very hard for folks is I have to be willing to get to the other side of boredom.
Yeah, right.
And I have to be willing to go off and be bored. And that's a hard thing to ask of people.
Dallas, that passage from Pascal about that.
Well, he has this wonderful statement about if people just knew that all of the troubles of humanity would be solved, if people knew how to go sit in.
It's the inability to sit in a room by themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's actually true, because once you begin to take yourself off of the outer stimulation, then you discover a whole different world. And there are few things that help you with that more than learning to hear God's voice in your heart and in your mind. Because all of a sudden, with that kind of word comes substance again. That is, boredom is actually a reflection of emptiness. And you can't, activities and distractions, such as Pascal always does such a wonderful job talking about how kings and others have to have people around to distract them. It doesn't cure the problem. It just puts it off. When you begin to experience the substance of your own soul and of God speaking in your soul, then suddenly you're not empty anymore.
And that's where what Kelly writes about the center, what's at the center of yourself, was so helpful. And the idea, which I had not thought about before, that not just with God, with any person, we always learn their voice by experience.
And that's, you're teaching about the quality of the voice of God and the spirit
Yes.
in the voice of God and the content.
You can isolate some factors in it, and that helps, because it will help you distinguish that voice from other voices.
Right.
But then you simply come to know that voice by its overall quality, just like you know the voice of others that you're familiar with.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing, you know.
Yeah, we don't have the physical part of it with God, but the other aspects of it, the content and the emotional tone to it and the effect that it has on us, we have that to recognize Him from.
And Kelly had that, and it calmed his life. And he writes in this little book, life from the center is a life of unhurried peace and power. It is simple, it is serene, it is amazing, it is triumphant, it is radiant. It takes no time, but it occupies all our time. And it makes our life programs new and overcoming. We need not get frantic. God is at the helm. And when our little day is done, we lie down quietly in peace, for all is well.
Isn't that beautiful?